So you may remember a little while back I did a live reading of the first 3 chapters of my book on TikTok. This was an amazing experience, partly because I got to film it in the beautiful Kaitoke Regional Park in Wellington. Some of you may recognize that name as the filming set for Rivendell. But also because so many of you were so excited to hear it, which is just so wonderful to me. Now, I feel I need to explain. It ended up being only the first 2 chapters, because as I have discovered, I am a terrible content creator. I'd thought of everything. I had a gorilla microphone stand that would work on any terrain. I had a microphone that would, filter out the wind. I didn't have a power pack. So we got about 2 chapters through, and my phone just goes 5% battery, 2% battery, dead. But I did find that the end of chapter 2 does really work better with the whole, taster ideal of what we were going for. But then, afterwards, a bunch of you messaged me telling me that you had missed it for whatever reason, and you'd been really looking forward to it. So, I figured out how to download said footage. You'll have to excuse the quality, the video is a bit choppy, but the audio is fine, and that's what's important. And I figured I'm going to post it here now. So without further ado, here are the first 2 chapters of my book, Harbingers of Ragnarok, read by me at Kaitoke Regional Park in Wellington. Take it away, me.
So, let's get started. Okay. Harbingers of Ragnarok, Berserker. Chapter 1. For a city that survived the firestorm, it sure was cold in Midgard. A thick fog hung over the city, bolstered by the smoke that billowed from the soot-covered smokestacks of the industrial district. Grey wisps danced and twisted around cracked stone roads, rising from the iron exhaust vents and swirling around my ankles. My hand ran, absent-mindedly, along the fine edge of the envelope in my jacket pocket, my jaw clenching as I considered its contents, my weekly pay and a notice of dismissal. I had tried to find other work among the factories of the industrial district, but now, with no other options, a brightly lit storefront across the street held my attention. The military registry shone like a star among the gloom and squalor of the various smoky street food vendors and shabby storefronts. The military would take anyone stupid enough to fight against the Jotun, that is. But due to my age, I would need my mother's consent before joining. My heart sank a little further as I rested my head on the wall behind me, looking up at the sky with a heavy sigh. My mother had been furious when I dropped out of school to find work, and the last time I suggested joining the military, well, I thought she'd never stop screaming. "The army is no kind of life for my son," her voice still echoed in my mind. It made my shoulders tense. "You want to join the military? Then they better have a house, a bed, and a mother too, because you won't be welcome here." A soft smile curled my lips. Even through the threats, I knew it was just because she cared for me. We had no one else, after all. My eyes narrowed on the registry door. That's it, I thought, taking a steadying breath and straightening my shoulders. Mother, forgive me, but it's the only way. The doors slid open with a chirpy ding as I entered. The shop was clean, not unusual for a council building, but a jarring parallel to any other civilian-owned shop in the market district. Concrete floors and steel furniture made it feel more like a warehouse than a registry. A shoddy television screen on the wall purveyed messages of the day. "Have you signed up for the Lord General Roll's army yet?" An overly chipper announcer's voice said through the speakers that crackled with static. My lip curled in disgust. Sigmund Roll was our current Lord General, the appointed voice of the council and head of Midgard's military. A leader of great military tact, though his lack of concern for the rest of the city caused him to have few followers among the common and working folk. An older lady sat at the desk across the room, obviously tired and bored as she tapped away at a keyboard. Her frizzy hair tied in a messy bun, her vibrant makeup in stark contrast to her grim expression. I approached the desk and smiled sheepishly. "Registration for infantry?" I said, trying to sound confident, though my voice was shaking. The lady sighed and pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose as she looked at me. "ID, please," she said in a nasal voice, looking up at me with framed eyes that almost screamed, "Kill me." I shook my head. "I don't have any," I replied sadly. I had hoped she would have overlooked my age, even though I was only 16, but I knew what came next. She rolled her eyes and turned back to her keyboard. After a few keystrokes, the printer next to her produced two forms, one blue and one white. "This one is your registration form," she said, handing me the blue one, then the white one. "This one is your guardian's consent form. Please have both filled out, signed, and then come back for registration." I felt my heart sink as I took the white form. I knew Mum wouldn't sign. The lady pushed her glasses up her nose again and looked at me glumly, obviously uninvested in my personal problems. As I turned to leave, a glinting bronze plaque on the wall caught my attention. It displayed the profile image of a proud man with short, swept-back hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Below the image were carved the words, "In honor of Lord General Garth Harkon, the savior of Midgard." My chest swelled. If there was ever a leader I could say I would be proud to follow, it would have been Harkon, our first Lord General, elected by the Council of Elders after the fateful day he stood to defend Midgard against the first Jotun raids. I heaved a sigh, looking down at the forms in my hand as I walked out into the cold air, already going over what I was going to say to Mum. How I was going to convince her to let me do this. Lines such as, "We need the money," or "It's the only way," seemed common in my mind. Such lines seemed appropriate for this situation. In my preoccupied rush out the door, I turned onto the street and collided with a passerby. Stumbling wildly, I fell to the ground, my forms landing on the pavement before me. The man I'd run into was all but unaffected by our collision. Gently dusting off his coat, he reached down and picked up my forms. An aspiring soldier should be more mindful of where he's going," the stranger said as he offered me a hand. "Or he may end up somewhere he didn't plan to be." Ignoring the man's offer, I got to my feet and dusted myself off before looking up at him. He was tall and lean, with a trimmed grey beard. He wore a long coat over a shabby grey suit and a fedora pulled low over his face. I smiled sheepishly and rubbed my head. "Seems that happens even when I have my eyes wide open." The man grinned and handed me my papers. "Perhaps you just need the right guidance," he said, adjusting his hat slightly. I took my papers and stepped away warily. This city was not without its creeps, and I was not about to get snatched. Noting my obvious suspicion, the man raised his hands, palms outwards in a peaceful display. "Forgive me, kid," the man said calmly. "I didn't mean me." He sidestepped to clear my path before straightening his collar. "Still, you know what they say about the gods closing a door." He tipped his hat again, flashing a silver blue eye at me. I watched the stranger disappear into the night before continuing home. The man's words lingered in my mind, but I had more important things to deal with. I continued to recite lines under my breath as I walked home. The square, stone buildings and shop fronts giving way to the quaint wooden huts, shacks, and towering living complexes of the residential district. Though my voice was confident, my mind was racked with doubt. Still shaken by my run-in with the stranger earlier, his words still echoed in my head like a broken record. I didn't understand. What options did I have? There was no window for me. It was the military or nothing. The warm, sweet smell of baked goods wafted past my nose as I reached the corner of my street, sparking an idea in my mind as I turned to gaze towards the bakery. A tray of skolbrød sat in the window. Skolbrød were simple pastry buns filled with custard and flavored with cardamom, but they were my mum's favorite. She always said they reminded me of her when she reminded her of when she was little. They always put her in a good mood. My last paycheck wasn't much, but it was more than enough for a box of 8. And if they worked, it didn't matter. Tucking the box under my arm, I continued home, trying to focus on the task at hand. My lines repeated over and over in my head, subtle tweaks applied each time. Tone, wording, it all had to be perfect if this was going to go ahead. In the dim street lights outside our doorstep, my mother stood fumbling with her keys, her hands full of shopping bags. Somehow, I still didn't quite believe my mother and I were related. Her sharp features, green eyes, and blonde hair stood in contrast to my deep brown hair and eyes. I had never met my father, but I could only imagine I must look like him. The thought made my skin crawl. My father was a businessman from the inner circle. I don't know how he and my mother met, or anything else about him. Mum didn't like to talk about him. All I knew was the moment he learned Mum was pregnant, he fled to the sanctuary of the inner circle. Here we go, I thought, adjusting my clothing and steeling myself for the argument to come. Showtime. Something in the background caught my attention as I approached. A shadow emerged from the darkness behind my mother, a coat concealing his body, a hood concealing his face. She didn't notice him approach, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw him, and it stopped completely when I saw the glint of metal as he produced a pistol. A blinding flash and a horrendous bang. Blood burst from my mother's chest. Groceries scattered across the concrete as she fell to the ground, dormant and lifeless. A cold numbness washed over me, the box of pastries falling from my trembling hand as I stared in horror and disbelief. Something left me at that moment, leaving a cold, empty space in my chest, a space that was quickly replaced with a burning anger that's consumed me like wildfire, boiling my blood and forcing a gurgling scream from my lungs. I charged forward, only one goal in my furious mind: tear him limb from limb. The assassin, alerted by my scream, turned to face me, the gun still in his hand, but I was already too close. He dodged my first strike with astonishing speed, my momentum carrying me past him until I managed to stop myself and strike again. Dodging again, the assassin struck me with a blow over the head with the butt of his sidearm. I kept coming back, again and again, determined to claim my kill. Each time I lashed out, I was repelled and knocked back to attack again. In one final, desperate strike, I charged and leapt towards his head, an attack fueled by fury and hate. But the assassin ducked and grabbed my wrist. He was done playing with me. His fist slammed into my solar plexus, a loud crack sending searing pain through my sternum as he lifted me and slammed me into the concrete. The air was driven from my lungs as I grimaced with the impact, the metallic tang of blood creeping over my tongue. I opened my eyes and saw my mother's face, red streaks running across her cheeks and forehead, her eyes staring blankly at the sky. Tears welled in my eyes as I reached for her hand, my fury subsiding under the weight of my grief. I had nothing left, no hope, no energy, no will to continue. The night was still and silent, save for the sound of my own wheezing breath and the falling rain. I craned my neck to look at the street, at the dark and still houses. Through my hazed vision, I saw one curtain move, opening a crack for an unseen watcher, and quickly closing again. We had been heard and ignored. Why? I sobbed through clenched teeth, turning back to face the hooded assassin. What could you possibly gain from this? The man aimed the muzzle of his pistol at my chest. Though most of his face was in shadow, his mouth and jaw were stern and solemn. For the sake of the father, the child must die, he said. The line sounded rehearsed, but I knew exactly what it meant. Father. Darkness engulfed my vision as the assassin pulled the trigger. I didn't hear the gunshot or see the muzzle flash. My world just went black. All was still and quiet as I lay in the dark, tears running down my clenched jaw. Sorry, Mother, I whispered to the darkness. I should have been there sooner. I should have... You couldn't have saved her. A voice spoke suddenly. My eyes shot open in shock, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me. I inspected my surroundings carefully. Darkness spanned out as far as I could see. No, not darkness. Blackness. Nothingness. I looked down. Looking down, my body was as visible as in daylight, but looking past that, there was nothing. Where was I? "But I can save you." The voice spoke again from behind me. I spun around to see a boy standing a few paces away. Not much older than me. His hazel eyes peered at me sharply, framed by sharp cheekbones and arched eyebrows. His hair, a mess of dreadlocks, was tied back in a ponytail. He wore a shabby singlet and jeans, his feet bare. "Who are you?" I asked. I was expecting my voice to echo in the hollow darkness, but it didn't. The boy smiled warmly. "A friend. Another soul lost and forgotten by his own. You can call me Fen." I looked around, trying to figure out where he'd come from. "How did you get here?" Fen looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping a little as he answered. "I ran here. Away from the anger and hate, trying to find a place where I could be free. But all I found is that nowhere is safe." He didn't look much older than me, but I needed to be wary. My mother had told me stories of beings from the other realms, and something about him told me he was older than he appeared. "I can help you, Malik," Fen said. "Together, we can help each other." "Can you bring my mother back?" I asked, my voice trembling with desperate hope. Fen shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I can help you bring the ones who killed her to justice." My nostrils flared. The memory of the man who killed me, who killed my mother, the hooded assassin, and his words seared into my brain. "For the sake of the Father." So, my father ordered our deaths, commanded the death of his own kin, his own child. The hot fury burning in my chest turned to something dark and cold. Hatred. "Him," I growled through gritted teeth. Fen looked into my eyes, peering sharply as if he was seeing everything I was feeling. All the pain, all the anger. It seemed familiar to him. "I can show you the way," he said, holding out his hand, "if you just walk with me until the time is right." I took his hand without hesitation. There was nothing left of me but rage and hate. It burned in my veins. Fen smiled and reached his other hand towards my forehead. "What are you doing?" I exclaimed, pulling away from him a little. Fen recoiled for a moment, startled by my query. A warm smile curled his lips, showing pearly white teeth. "Opening a window." He gripped my head, and with a flash of light, I woke with a gasp in the pouring rain. "I need a stretch, because this is not a seat." Chapter 2. My hand shot to my chest as I sat bolt upright, gasping for breath as thunder rumbled overhead. I had died, killed in cold blood and passed on, hadn't I? I found the hole in my shirt where the bullet had passed through, lifting it to see the bruised scar in my chest. I rested my hand over the scar and, after a moment, was relieved to feel the beating of my own heart. I was still in the street where I had fallen. My heart froze when I saw my mother's body still lying next to me, her eyes staring blankly at the sky. With a trembling hand, I brushed the hair from her face, her skin pale and cold to the touch, blood running with the storm water across her skin to the pavement. "I will make them pay," I said quietly. "I promise." Hopeless anger took hold as I looked around at the street, silent and dark. No sirens, no calls, nothing. I glared in disgust at the dormant houses. Cowards, all of them. Even after the danger was gone, they wouldn't help or even call for help. I was alone. I took my mother's body in my arms. I couldn't leave her in the street. She deserved a proper burial, and I wanted to send a message to our neighbors. Things would change. I would change them. I laid my mother in her bed, her arms folded across her stomach, as one would lie on a funeral pyre, a peaceful picture, but I dared not look at it for long. I ran to the kitchen, to the gas lines for the oven, unhooking each one at the inlet to fill the house with fumes. Matches in hand, I took one last look at the house. For years this had been my home, my sanctuary. Now it was the most alienating place on earth. Best to be rid of it. The smell of gas told me my time was up. I moved quickly to the door and, striking the match, tossed it into the kitchen. In an instant, I was thrown back by the explosion of flame that erupted, blowing out the windows and sending me hurtling out the door. Slamming into the wall, the back of my head hit the brick with a crack as I slumped to the ground. As I watched the flames grow, dazed and overcome by fumes, my vision blurred. I thought I saw something in the fire. Two beasts, a wolf and a bear. They were fighting, but as quickly as they came, they disappeared. Urgency took hold as I returned to my immediate situation. The fire would attract attention, and I didn't want to be here if the military showed up. I would be arrested on sight. Besides, there was no reason for me to stay here any longer. I could feel myself swaying as I walked through the city streets, still delirious from the knock I'd taken, my vision blurring from left to right. People who passed me gave me a wide berth and gripped their valuables tightly. I couldn't blame them. I probably looked like drunken riffraff. It began as an echo, a soothing voice calling softly from afar. As I strained to focus, it became clearer and clearer. Hey, mister! I turned to my right to see a young girl's blurred face. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. She clutched a patchwork teddy bear and had a pink bow tying back her brown hair. She looked up at me with wide green eyes. Are you okay, mister? I think you're hurt. I lifted my hand to feel the back of my head. As I lowered it, my fingertips were covered with blood. Must have been from the collision with the wall. The girl smiled and hugged her teddy bear tight. Mummy said if Mr. Tibbles ever gets an owie, she'll fix him for me, so he feels better, she said, visibly cheered up. Maybe she can fix you too. I wanted to object, but I was too weak to talk. The girl took my bloodied hand and led me into the slums. She was practically carrying me by the time we arrived at a small shack, my vision a blur of blotched shapes and lights, fading every so often into darkness. My strength was failing, my neck barely keeping my head up, my feet dragging as I did my best not to crush this poor girl. We had been walking for some time when I heard a door as it swung open with a bang. Ira, a woman shouted, a panic in her voice. What are you doing? I assumed this was her mother from her reaction. Having her daughter bring home stray pets was an annoyance. Having her bring home bleeding, house-burning, street-walking zombies was a whole story of its own. He was hurt and lost, she called. The optimism in her voice clearly showed she had misread the situation. Can you fix him? Ira was pulled from under me suddenly, causing me to fall to my hands and knees. I couldn't see anymore, but I could hear Ira and her parents bickering. Ira, you cannot just bring home strangers, sweetheart, the mother scolded. But he's bleeding! Ira pleaded in a cracking voice. I could hear she was almost in tears. Her father cut in with a stern voice. Listen to your mother, he said. We cannot draw attention to ourselves. Ira stuttered an objection, but I cut her off. This was going nowhere and just upsetting everyone. It's okay, I mumbled, rising shakily to my feet. I don't want to cause trouble. I'll leave. My legs gave out as I took my first step. Falling heavily to the ground, I lapsed into unconsciousness again on the pavement. The smell of smoke woke me, flashing memories. What I had seen, what I had done. My eyes snapped open as I sat bolt upright. A thin blanket cushioned the hard floor beneath me, feebly shielding me from the cold wooden floorboards. Thankfully, the room wasn't that cold due to the fire which burned in the hearth in the next room. My head was pounding like a drum, sending shocks of pain through my neck and shoulders, and a sickly feeling to my stomach. Clenching my eyes shut, I gripped my head and took a deep breath to try and stop the spinning. Had it continued, I would have been sick. To my surprise, I found my wounds had been tended to while I slept. My head was wrapped in thick, rough bandages, bound tightly around my hair and the spot where I'd struck the wall. I could feel the hard spot on the back of my head where the blood had soaked through. The room I lay in, while small, was comfortably furnished with shabby mismatched chairs and shelves. Doing myself in there. Many of the cushions were covered in stitching and patches of different faded colors. Framed by the doorway across the room, Ira slept soundly on a couch, her head resting in an older woman's lap. The woman, who I assumed was Ira's mother, was reading a book and hadn't noticed me wake up. She was a fair woman, with pale skin, dark eyes, and brown hair tied in a bun. She sat with her legs folded under her, stroking Ira's hair as she slept, both wrapped in a blanket. A lump formed in my throat. What would usually be a wholesome, heartwarming sight now filled me with grief. I swallowed and looked away, blinking away tears. Had I watched any longer, I would have been overwhelmed by my sorrow. My shirt and jumper lay folded on the floor next to where I lay, along with my shoes and a bowl of water. My eyes widened as I dove for the vessel. I was parched, the cool liquid a blissful relief as I drank it heartily. My body was sore and stiff as I gingerly got to my feet. It wasn't the first time I'd slept on the floor, but it wasn't one of many. I stretched and rubbed my neck before pulling on my shirt and jumper and shuffling to the front door, hoping some fresh air would calm the thumping pain in my skull. The rain had stopped. Water dripped from the edge of the porch. The night was still and dark. Only a few sparse street lights still working. "You shouldn't be up," a voice rumbled from my right. I turned to see an older man sitting in a wooden chair, a blanket across his legs. As he shifted his hands, I noticed the handle of an axe under the blanket. He was a large man with rough, swarthy skin and grey flecks through his short, dark hair and scruffy beard. His eyes were the same piercing green as Ira's. So this was her father. "You shouldn't be helping me," I retorted. I wasn't ungrateful. I owed my life to this family, but this man was scared, and if my suspicion was right, I knew why. "You're Neething, aren't you?" There were colonies outside of Midgard, villages and shanty towns where people lived. Those born outside of Midgard could not get citizenship within Midgard. Those who came to live here were considered Neething. This meant they had no rights within the city. The law didn't even apply around them. If a Neething turned up murdered in the street, there would be no investigation. The body would be disposed of and forgotten. The man flinched a little, his head turning to glare at me. "And what if we are?" he asked, his tone stern and defensive. I took a step back and bowed my head, scolding myself for my disrespectful tone. "I'm sorry, sir," I said respectfully. "I meant nothing by it." The man sighed and turned his head back to the street. The black marks under his eyelids told me that he hadn't slept in some time, though it seemed he was used to it. "Why were you out in the street like that?" The question sounded more accusatory than curious. I looked down at my hands. "I was in an accident," I answered. "I made it out somehow. My mother didn't." The man's face darkened in remorse. "I'm sorry," he said gruffly. "Did you report it?" "What's the point?" I snarled, looking up at the Tower of Midgard with contempt. "What would they have done?" The porch fell silent as I glared at the tower with grim intent. Sparkled in the night, every light glowing, every panel polished, almost mocking the dank, steaming undergrowth it loomed over. "Get some sleep," the man grumbled. "I'll wake you in the morning before we go." I looked back in confusion. Where are we going? The man looked up at me again with a smirk. "Somewhere safe," he replied, before settling back down into his chair, his vigilant gaze turning to scan the street once more. Anxiety turned my stomach as I returned to bed as ordered. Where was he taking me tomorrow? Should I trust him? I didn't really have another choice, and it would be rude to doubt them now, after all they had done. "Your soul is torn," a voice spoke softly as I passed the doorway to the living room. I turned to see Ira lying with her head in her mother's lap, her eyes wide open and fixed on me. Her mother was fast asleep, her book still in her hand. "What?" I asked, not sure if this was really happening. Her tone was cold and monotone, her cadence flat and dry as she continued. "A bear and a wolf in constant struggle. If the bear should fall, the wolf will be free, and the beast we all should fear will be whole once more and drown the sky in blood." With those words, her eyelids shut slowly, and she slept as if nothing had happened. A bear and wolf, I pondered, recalling my vision in the flames of my mother's pyre. What does that mean? The words plagued me, but I could feel my head getting heavier with each passing moment. My wounds were taking their toll. I needed to sleep. I lay down and fell into a troubled sleep, tossing and turning until the sun rose, and I rose with it. Midgard was beautiful in the morning light. The sun coated the city bright yellow with pink highlights. Buildings of steel and concrete turned into temples of gold in an instant. I sat on the porch and watched the colors change, a spectacle I would watch with my mother when I was little. Dancing colors used to make me happy, but now, after everything that had happened last night, it simply filled me with sorrow and anger. How could they live such a charmed life while others suffered in the slums? How could they ignore the plight of those outside their walls? "You're up early," Ira's father said as he walked out onto the porch with a cup of coffee. "That is, for a boy who thrashes about in his sleep like a Jotun is upon him." I smiled sheepishly, feeling foolish for thinking no one would notice my troubled sleep in such a small home. My night had been plagued with nightmares. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother lying on the pavement with that smug assassin standing over her. "It's never happened before," I replied, my voice breaking a little as I spoke. "I've had troubled sleep before, but not like that." I looked up and smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry if I disturbed anyone." The man shook his head. "You have suffered more grief and sorrow in one night than any man should. You have no need to apologize." He shrugged and looked down at his coffee. "Anyway, I don't sleep much. Anira and Rosalind could sleep through a damn hurricane." I stifled a chuckle, but the mention of Ira's mother's name reminded me that I had not introduced myself. I reached up my hand for a handshake. "My name's Malik, by the way." The man switched his mug to his other hand and shook my hand firmly, though his expression remained stern. "Aaron," he almost grunted before returning his squinting gaze to the street. On top of his grey woolen jumper from last night, he had added a long weathered coat with a hood, as well as gloves and heavy leather boots. "Come on," he said quietly, jerking his head towards the street. "Time to go." Anxious excitement gripped me as I got to my feet, dusting myself off and zipping up my jumper, ready to get going. Aaron seemed to pause as I stood before him, the slight curl of a smile complementing the proud glint in his eyes as he seemed to gaze at me warmly. I paused for a moment. Unsure of what to do, I tapped my legs awkwardly. Aaron shook his head and blinked, broken from his sudden reverie. not sure if the wind's being picked up. This mic is meant to be stopping the wind, but hopefully it's not too loud. Sorry, he said, turning to the door. Ira, he shouted down the hall. Come say goodbye. Come on, stop it. Cut it out. Thank you. That's alright, Mikhail. Sleep is important, so... Ira ran to the door with a playful bound in her step and hugged me tightly around the waist like a sibling, squeezing my stomach until I couldn't breathe. I stood frozen, shocked by both the sudden show of affection and the surge of pain through my ribs. Ira looked up at me and smiled. You'll come visit, yeah? She asked, her eyes wide in expectation. I smiled back, suppressing my urge to question her about last night. Better to act like it never happened rather than risk upsetting her and her parents. If you'd like that, I replied. Not sure what her father would say on the subject. Though he seemed to have warmed up to me, I still didn't think he'd want to see me again. Rosalind came to the door and leant on its frame, smiling fondly at me. Look after yourself, okay? The sentiment caught me off guard, as her mothering nature reminded me of my loss the night before. I bowed my head to her respectfully, squashing my sorrow with a cough. Thank you for your help, I replied. I'm sure I would be dead without you. Don't be so sure, Rosalind said with a sly smile. The bandages stopped the bleeding, but you have healed quite quickly. My body stiffened in shock as I remembered my encounter with Fen. Had it been real? It all happened so fast I thought it was a dream. Call it luck, I joked, looking away to relieve the tension. Rosalind smiled. Call it what you want. Just be careful. I nodded and looked to Aaron, who coughed and looked out at the street as if checking for danger. Come on, he urged. We should be going. He pulled his hood over his head and walked out to the gate with me in tow. As I passed through the gate, I turned to wave a last goodbye to Ira and her mother before pulling my hood up and following Aaron into the city. Aaron led me back through the slums towards the center of the city, the earthen streets and ramshackle huts left behind in favor of stone roads, impressive barrack structures, and temples as we made our way through the military district. My eyes boggled at the grand polished statues and sharp, glorious design of the architecture. I had never been in the military district. My mother would have killed me if she found me here. Though he walked with stoic purpose, it became clear something was bothering Aaron. He kept glancing at me and looking over his shoulder as if someone was following us. Finally, I gave in to curiosity. Is something wrong? I asked, trying to follow his gaze to see what he was looking at. Aaron glanced at me again, his sharp eyes almost seeming to pierce mine. Did Ira say something to you? He asked pointedly. The hairs on my neck stood on end. What makes you say that? Your reaction to her hug this morning, Aaron explained. It was as if she was a completely different person to you. I wanted to deny it, but it would have been pointless. Ira spoke to me last night, but it didn't seem like her. Her face was blank, expressionless, and it was like something was speaking through her. Aaron finished my sentence. My eyes widened in surprise. This has happened before? Aaron pressed a finger over his lips in a gesture to make me hush. Have you heard of the Valkyrie? He asked. The Valkyrie were a privatized military group, one of 4 within Midgard. an army of women with powers believed to be granted by Freya herself. They were known for being healers and seers, gifted with the visions of the future. Ira has the powers of the Valkyrie, Aaron continued. She has visions and often speaks words she doesn't remember later. Though this is a gift, we know if the Valkyrie find her, she will be taken from us, and we would most likely be evicted from Midgard. My blood ran cold. Now I understood why Aaron hadn't wanted to help me in the first place. You were trying to protect Ira, I stated, again forgetting my orders to keep my voice down. That's why you didn't want to take me in. Aaron nodded. Ira is naturally kind and charitable, another trait of the Valkyrie. But in doing so, she tends to draw attention to herself. Rosalind and I do what we can to keep her secret. He stopped and turned to face me, prompting me to do the same. What did Ira say to you last night? He asked, searching my face for any sign of deceit. I shrugged, trying to remember exactly what she told me. I don't entirely remember. Something like, your soul is torn, if the bear falls, the wolf will win, or something like that? I stumbled through the answer, feeling foolish as I did. Aaron looked thoughtful for a moment. A bear and a wolf, you say? He asked after a moment in silence. Yeah, I replied, my brow furrowing in curiosity. Why? Aaron smiled and pointed behind me. Because that is the Berserker stronghold. My jaw hung loose at the glory of the sight in front of me. A huge building, a fortress of dark blue stone, loomed over us. Pillars as thick as oak trees, carved with runes and ancient knotwork designs, held aloft equally ornate crossed wooden beams at the front of the roof, their ends carved with the stylized heads, one of a bear, the other a wolf. Bear and wolf. Could it be? My sentence was cut short as I turned to see Aaron had disappeared. I scanned the crowd, but he was gone. I was alone. Thank you, I whispered before heading towards the building. Chapter 3. Oh, time to get up. Oh, that is not good. We gotta get through this quick, because my phone is dying. Ugh. Commanding the air itself. I wish.
And that's about where the video cut out. I'm really sorry that happened. As I said, I am bad at making content. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little taster of my book. More updates to come. This should be happening very soon. Thank you all so much for believing in me and in this project. I really hope it's everything you hope it is. Until next time, guys, have a good one.